There's a particular kind of tragedy that nobody talks about. It happens in homes where there's a child, a special one, the one who had it all figured out, or at least the one who looked like they will soon. They were the success story, the proof that your parents did something right. They were the achievement, the validation, the reason to be proud. And then something breaks. Not in a way you can see coming, it just breaks, without warning. The golden child falls, and everyone is shocked. How is this possible? This person who had everything, this person who was supposed to have it all figured out, this person who was supposed to succeed, how did they fail? You might know someone like this, someone who was the favorite, someone who got the best opportunities, someone who was told constantly that they were special, that they were different, that they were destined for greatness. You watched them climb higher and higher, and then you watched them crash. Or maybe you are someone like this. Maybe you were the golden child. Maybe you grew up being told you were exceptional. Maybe you internalized that message so deeply that it became your identity. Maybe you spent your entire childhood and young adulthood proving that you were worthy of that label. And maybe, at some point, you broke. And when you did, the fall was catastrophic. Here's what's important to understand about golden children. They don't become golden by accident. There's usually a reason. A parent who has dreams they didn't achieve, a family that needs a savior, a household where one child is unconsciously designated as the one who will make it all worth it, the one who will succeed where others failed, the one who will fix the family pain through their accomplishment. And that child, trying to be good, trying to be worthy, tries to live up to that role. They work hard, they excel, they achieve, they become everything they were told they could be. And for a while, it works. But here's what nobody tells you about being the golden child. The pressure is suffocating. The expectations are impossible. The bar is always being raised. Because the moment you reach one level of achievement, the expectation shifts. Now you have to go higher. Now you have to be better. Now you have to prove that the previous success wasn't a fluke. It was just the beginning. There's always another level, always another mountain to climb, always another way you're not quite enough. And the scary part is that you can't fail. You literally cannot fail. Because if you fail, if you fall short, if you don't achieve, then what are you? What's your purpose? What's your value? You've been told your entire life that your worth is tied to your success, that your lovability is contingent on your achievement, that the reason your family is proud of you is because you're succeeding. So the thought of not succeeding becomes existentially terrifying because it means you're not worthy. It means you're not special. It means you're just regular. And regular is unacceptable. So you push. You push so hard. You work so hard. You achieve and achieve and achieve. You become the person everyone expected you to be. You reach the milestones. You hit the markers of success. You do everything right. And somewhere along the way, you become a ghost. Because the real you, the actual you with your own dreams and desires and interests and needs, that person gets buried under the weight of what you're supposed to be. The thing about golden children is that they often don't have a real sense of self. They have a constructed self, a self that was designed to meet the family's needs, a self that's an extension of someone else's dreams, a self that's performing constantly. And performing is exhausting. You're always on. You're always aware of how you're being perceived. You're always managing other people's pride and expectations. You're always calculating whether your next move will be impressive enough, Will it make them proud enough? Will it be special enough? And then life happens. Sometimes it's a small thing. You don't get into the top college. You don't get the job you wanted. You have a relationship fail. You make a mistake. Something ordinary that happens to everyone. But for the golden child, ordinary is catastrophic because you're not supposed to fail. You're not supposed to struggle. You're not supposed to be vulnerable. You're supposed to be exceptional. And when you're not, when you fail like everyone else fails, the entire foundation of your identity crumbles. That's when the falling apart begins. Sometimes it's dramatic, a breakdown, a crisis, a moment where you can't hold it together anymore and everyone sees it. Sometimes it's slow, a gradual dimming, a withdrawal, a loss of enthusiasm that nobody can explain. But what's happening underneath is the same thing. You're realizing that you can't be perfect. You're realizing that you've spent your entire life chasing something that doesn't exist. You're realizing that the version of yourself you created to be worthy doesn't actually exist. And without that version, you don't know who you are. And here's what's devastating. When the golden child falls, they fall hard because they've never learned how to struggle. They've never learned how to recover from failure. They've never learned that failure is part of being human. They've been protected from that reality by being exceptional. So when it finally hits them, when they finally fail, they don't have the skills to cope. They don't have the resilience. They don't have the ability to dust themselves off and try again. Because trying again means admitting they're not special. Trying again means being ordinary. Trying again means being vulnerable. And vulnerability is terrifying when you've spent your whole life proving you don't need it. The mental health crisis that often follows is severe. Depression, anxiety, sometimes substance abuse, sometimes reckless behavior, sometimes a complete withdrawal from life because the light has gone out. The thing that was supposed to make them special, the achievement, the success, it's revealed itself as an illusion, and without it, they feel empty, worthless, invisible. They feel like they're nothing, and that feeling is worse than any physical pain. What makes this even more complicated is the response from the family. Because when the golden child falls apart, the family often doesn't know how to handle it. This was the one who was supposed to be fine. This was the one who was supposed to succeed. This was the one who was supposed to be the family's source of pride. And now they're broken. And the family's response is often to either try to fix it or to disappear. Some parents will push the child to get back on track. You can recover from this. You're too special to stay down. Other parents will withdraw their support because you've revealed yourself to be less than what they believed you were. The siblings often have complicated feelings too. They watched the golden child get all the attention, all the resources, all the praise, and there was often resentment there, unspoken resentment. And now the golden child is falling apart, and sometimes the siblings feel relief, sometimes they feel vindication, sometimes they feel justified in the anger they've been carrying. But sometimes they also feel guilt, because the fall is ugly, and they realize that the golden child was carrying something heavy all along, that the shine came at a cost. What's really tragic is that the fall of the golden child often means the loss of their identity, because if they're not successful, if they're not exceptional, if they're not achieving, then who are they? And that question is terrifying because they've never had to answer it before. Their identity was always tied to external markers, grades, achievements, accomplishments, accolades. Now all of that is stripped away, and they're left with just themselves, and themselves feels empty, worthless, unknown. The recovery process is brutal, because recovery means accepting that they were set up for this, that someone they loved, someone they trusted, someone they wanted to make proud, actually created a psychological prison. And they lived in that prison for so long that they thought it was normal. They thought it was just how life was. And now they have to grieve that. They have to grieve the childhood they didn't have. They have to grieve the self they never got to develop. They have to grieve the innocence of simply existing without having to achieve. Many golden children who fall apart struggle with perfectionism for the rest of their lives because the need to be perfect was so deeply engraved. Even when they rationally understand that perfectionism is harmful, even when they consciously reject the messaging they received, even when they work in therapy to process it, the voice is still there. The voice that says you're not good enough. The voice that says you need to do more. The voice that says your value is contingent on what you produce. And relationships become incredibly complicated because golden children often choose partners who either reinforce the perfectionism or are on the opposite extreme. They choose people who demand a lot from them, continuing the pattern they learned at home, or they choose people who are totally chaotic, trying to compensate for the rigidity of their own childhood. Either way, it's not a healthy dynamic, because they're either replicating the trauma or running from it. They're not choosing from a place of wholeness. What makes the recovery possible is something many golden children never experience until they fall. Unconditional love. Love that isn't tied to achievement. Love that exists simply because they exist. Many golden children have to find this in therapy, in relationships with people who love them despite their failures, in communities that value them for who they are, not what they do. And when they experience that for the first time, something shifts. They start to understand that they don't have to be exceptional to be worthy, that being ordinary is okay, that being human with flaws and limitations and needs is actually acceptable. But getting to that point often requires hitting bottom. It requires falling apart so completely that the old identity cannot be resurrected. It requires grieving the life they thought they were going to have. It requires accepting that they were set up for failure by the people who loved them most. It requires radical forgiveness, not of the family necessarily, but of themselves. Forgiveness for believing they had to be exceptional. Forgiveness for the years spent chasing something that wasn't real. Forgiveness for the self that got lost along the way. The thing about golden children who fall apart is that they often become the most self-aware people you know, because they've been forced to do the work that most people avoid. They've had to examine who they really are underneath all the achievement. They've had to sit with their own worthlessness and discover that it's not actually true. They've had to rebuild their identity from scratch, and that process, while devastating, can also be transformative. If you were the golden child, if you were told you were special, if you were expected to be exceptional, if your worth was tied to your achievement, and if that all eventually fell apart, you're not alone. So many people carry this wound. So many people have lived this story, and the falling apart wasn't failure. It was actually the beginning of real growth. It was the moment where you finally had permission to be human, to be imperfect, to be ordinary, and that, paradoxically, is when you actually started becoming whole. The recovery from being the golden child isn't about getting back to the top. It's not about climbing higher or achieving more or proving something. It's about learning to exist without needing to prove anything at all. It's about discovering that you have value simply because you're alive. It's about building a real identity instead of a constructed one. It's about learning to love yourself, not for what you produce, but for who you are. And that's actually harder than climbing to the top,
but it's also the only thing that will ever feel truly like success.
If this resonates, if you were the golden child and you felt the weight of those expectations, if you've experienced the fall and the shattering of identity that comes with it, if you're in the process of rebuilding, subscribe. Because we're exploring the hidden wounds that families create in the name of love. We're looking at the patterns that hurt us when we were just trying to be worthy. We're creating a space where the pressure can finally be released, where you can stop performing, where you can finally rest. Until next time, know this: you are worthy, not because of what you achieve. You are worthy because you exist. That's it. That's enough.